You've probably had this debate in your team. Should we just spin up a private channel, use a shared channel, or make another team? If you've ever regretted the decision once permissions chaos or missing apps hit, you're definitely not alone. Today, we're clearing up which is more secure, where big limitations kick in, and some role-specific DOs and don'ts Microsoft doesn't spell out. If you want to end second-guessing which channel to use, especially for sensitive or cross-company projects, stick around. The subtle mistakes here catch even seasoned admins off guard. Private channels aren't a silver bullet, what Microsoft doesn't tell you. If you've ever thought spinning up a private channel would keep your sensitive conversations airtight, it's easy to see why. On the surface, private channels promise that security dream. Make a team, carve out that channel for only a handful of people, and trust that nobody else will see what's inside. No interruptions, no leaks, no prying eyes. But the real headaches start when you need the channel to do more than just hide chat. That's where the cracks appear, and it's not just because someone forgot to click a box in the admin center. Let's get into what actually happens the moment you try to work normally inside a private channel. First, app integration is a regular point of friction. If you've ever tried adding something like the HR tool you rely on, or even a tab for Power BI, you may have noticed that some apps just don't appear. The Teams app experience in private channels is sliced way down compared to what you get in the rest of a team. There are technical reasons for this, but for most admins and end users, it feels pretty random. One day the app is there, next it's grayed out or nowhere to be found. Security-wise, private channels certainly wall things off, but there's confusion baked right in. Most admins start out thinking those permissions are just a narrower version of their normal team settings. Instead, private channels come with a kind of shadow SharePoint site set apart from the main team site with its own list of owners and members. On paper, this should make things easier to control. In practice, this is where files get lost or permissions go out of sync. File storage is now happening on a different SharePoint site altogether. So when retention policies, sharing rules, or compliance holds come up, private channel files don't fall neatly in line with the rest of the team. I've seen this get ugly in the wild. An HR team working on sensitive reviews needed a Power Automate workflow running on their files. It worked great in the general team, but the moment they moved that workflow to a private channel, nothing triggered. Why? The automation was set to detect files in the main SharePoint site, but private channel files quietly started living in their own silo. Nobody realized this until payday rolled around and some feedback forms were missing. That scramble to reconnect apps and untangle permission mismatches didn't feel like a win for security or productivity. Here's where Microsoft's own documentation leaves people hanging. They'll tell you private channels are for sensitive conversations, but read between the lines. Half the limitations aren't called out until you've already set everything up. Even seasoned admins can end up troubleshooting guest access, discovering that invited guests in the parent team won't carry over to a private channel unless you add them yet again. Or maybe you find a key channel tab crashing only to spot a small footnote that integration with some line of business app isn't supported here. If you're picturing the team's permissions hierarchy in your head, this is where things get messy. Think of your team as a house. You've given out keys, set up some smart locks, you know who lives where. Then with a private channel, you've actually built a basement apartment with a separate door, different locks, and a secret guest list. Dropping files down there, they land in a different SharePoint basement closet. Forget a key or misconfigure the locks, and even the owner of the main house might get stuck outside. This is why missing files, broken access, or ghosted messages in private channels are such a common pain point for IT. There are other hidden trade-offs too. Discoverability drops. Channel search will not show private channel discussions for anyone who isn't a member, which makes compliance review work trickier. Administration gets clunky. Every private channel acts like its own mini team, but without all the admin knobs. Auto governance, retention labels, auditing, even those end up being handled differently than you might expect. If you were hoping for elegant oversight across the whole team, private channels demand a more piecemeal approach that isn't obvious from the team's admin center at all. So here's the short version. Private channels absolutely solve the not everyone needs to know this problem, but you pay for that barrier. Lost apps, bottleneck permissions, and compliance hiccups aren't just quirks, they're baked into how this feature works. Many admins only find out after something goes sideways, and they're forced to dig through SharePoint admin logs or submit a service ticket wondering why one policy worked everywhere but here. If you expect private channels to snap into place as a universal answer, that mindset leads straight to frustration. Team sets you up to think you're solving a security challenge, but really you're trading collaboration flexibility for these little landmines. So now you're probably wondering, if private channels can close one door but accidentally lock up the kitchen too, what's left? There's another option, shared channels, which Microsoft quietly introduced to promise permission control without the same headaches. But do they actually deliver, or are we signing up for different surprises? Let's put private channels side by side with shared channels and see what's really at stake. Private versus shared channels, the real difference is nobody explains. If you've clicked that shared channel option thinking it's just another flavor of private channel, you're definitely not alone. Microsoft's interface doesn't exactly spell out what's really going on, so it's tempting to treat them as more or less the same tool. Both options are sitting right there, both promise to keep some conversations and files locked down, and both let you handpick who gets a seat at the table. But that surface level similarity starts to fall apart the minute you actually put them to work. Here's where a lot of teams get tripped up. A private channel does a great job of drawing a line, access is cut off sharply, only selected members get in, and any stray invite or mistake is blocked at the door. But shared channels flip the model. Instead of putting up additional walls, they open doors for collaboration, including with people outside your own organization. Think of it like building a conference room that crosses the street to your vendor's building, so both teams just walk in and get to work. No need to add guests to the whole team or juggle extra teams for external partners. Just give them access to a shared channel and they're in, using their own credentials. But here's the catch. The experience under the hood changes in a lot of subtle ways. Start with file storage. Private channels spin up their own SharePoint site, as you've probably already run into, but everything is walled off from the rest of the team. Shared channels, on the other hand, keep files under the team's main SharePoint site, but manage access with specific permissions at the folder and document level. So while both are private to outsiders, shared channel files don't get siloed in quite the same way and usually have an easier time fitting into your existing compliance policies. Guest permissions create another wrinkle. With private channels, you're completely out of luck. If you want to bring in someone from a different tenant, you simply can't. I've seen this grind big projects to a halt. One consulting firm tried using a private channel to work with external vendors. Weeks into the project, they discovered the hard rule. You can only add guests who exist in your org's directory, and they have to be manually added one by one. When they needed an outside vendor to quickly review a set of sensitive files, there was no way to make it happen in that channel, not without blowing up the whole setup and bringing that vendor into way more team content than they needed. In contrast, shared channels are built for those cross-organization scenarios. They let you invite external users as long as both tenants have external access enabled. The difference is more than a technicality. It changes how your whole project operates. App integrations. The differences keep mounting. Many of the standard tabs, bots, and integrations that work everywhere else in Teams just don't show up in private channels. In shared channels, you get better support for apps, especially the ones built to work cross-tenant, though not every integration is guaranteed. If your workflow depends on a specific automation, or you're counting on a bot to keep your team and vendors connected, shared channels will usually play nicer. That said, you'll still want to verify that your key apps can actually function in those spaces, because there are always a few outliers. There's a persistent myth here worth breaking, that private channels are a tidy alternative to spinning up a whole new team for every confidential subgroup. It sounds good in theory, but when you look at ownership, lifecycle, and permission sprawl, private channels aren't a shortcut. They're just a different set of headaches. The permissions hierarchy doesn't get any simpler. Now you have mini admin responsibilities for every private channel, plus a growing pile of fragmentary SharePoint sites scattered throughout your tenant. In contrast, shared channels let you keep related projects together and handle permissions with more granularity. There's less administrative overhead when it comes time to manage membership, expiration, or archives. Picture a simple permission matrix. In a regular team channel, everyone in the team is in by default. For a private channel, only those you specifically add get in, plus a new SharePoint site is spun up and owned by the channel's creators and members. With shared channels, it's similar. Only direct invitees see the content, but external users can participate seamlessly, all while files live in the core team's SharePoint, not a side site. Now, if you're managing data retention or eDiscovery, this gets tricky. Private channel compliance and retention settings run off that isolated SharePoint site, meaning any automated policies tied to the main team don't automatically extend over. Shared channels, though, inherit a lot more from their parent team, so your compliance stance is typically more consistent. The upshot: shared channels extend the reach of teams for those projects that cross company borders without blowing up your org chart or cluttering your teams list. Private channels serve truly internal discussions best, locking things away where even curious insiders can't snoop. But swap one in for the other, you can end up with frustrated users, messy permissions, and a surprising amount of cleanup after the fact. Sometimes, though, neither option delivers everything you want. A few gotchas can't be solved by clever channel setup alone. So what about those cases where both private and shared channels fall short? When does it just make sense to roll out a whole new team instead of slicing things up even further? It happens more often than you'd guess, especially when project complexity ramps up or must-have integrations refuse to cooperate. When to use a private channel, shared channel, or separate team, do's, don'ts, and deal breakers. If you've ever sat at your desk wishing Microsoft would just hand over a clear decision tree for Teams channels, you're not alone. Instead, we get a web of features, a handful of scattered docs, and way too many admin panels. Defaulting to private channels feels safe when something is even a little bit sensitive, but let's be honest, how often has that made things worse? The choice isn't as simple as if secret, then private channel. In real work, those fast picks open the door to headaches down the road. People lean on private channels because they promise a tighter circle, only the right eyes, not the entire team. But that instinct, especially with sensitive topics, can backfire when you try to do more than just chat. The tough part comes when a simple attempt at privacy holds a project hostage. Consider this: HR needs a focused place to discuss employee performance reviews. Here, a private channel actually hits the sweet spot. The team can meet, share files, and keep everything walled off from even the most curious coworkers. Compliance is straightforward enough, and as long as the work sticks to conversation and document review, things are smooth. Now compare that with another team tempted to use a private channel for a vendor project. The moment external input is required, the setup breaks. Private channels can't add guests outside your tenant, so any hope of quick external review, feedback, or even collaborative editing turns into a maze of file transfers and out-of-band chats. Permissions hit a brick wall, and suddenly a secure channel just means double work. By the end of the quarter, someone inevitably regrets that choice, especially when status updates and files have to be duplicated across teams or shuffled into email threads. So when actually should you use a private channel? The scenarios don't come up as often as people think. It's your go-to for confidential HR work like performance planning or salary discussions. Private channels work well for subgroup discussions, maybe a planning committee within a larger project team, where transparency for the subgroup matters, but secrecy from the wider group is essential. They also make sense if your app usage is basic and you're okay sacrificing certain integrations like workflows or approvals. The more your work lives in chat and files that don't move around too much, the less you'll notice the friction. But don't fall into the trap of using private channels when your work is cross-company, relies on outside partners, or needs complex app integration. The minute you expect to pull in someone from another organization, a private channel works against you. You've probably hit this wall with SharePoint workflows too. Since private channel files live in a breakaway SharePoint site, your automated processes often don't even see them. That's a big miss if your team uses Power Automate to keep compliance or drive project handoffs. Heavy reliance on apps and cross-system workflows often ends with a quiet failure, links that don't resolve, approvals that never trigger, or tabs that mysteriously disappear. These are signs you picked the wrong channel type. Separate teams come into play when things really get complex. If your group has high turnover, or if each participant needs their own set of apps and permissions, bite the bullet and spin up a distinct team. Compliance gets messy fast for projects that have special data retention needs or sensitive content subject to legal holds. Here, a separate team gives you control, flexibility, and the ability to manage lifecycle policies the right way. You'll notice this most on projects that run long or shift members frequently. Trying to push a high-churn, highly regulated project through a single team with private or shared channels is just asking for a permission snarl and a SharePoint mess. One admin I spoke to set up a private private channel for a short-term audit. 6 months later, after the channel owner left and two more stakeholders were added, the team was locked out of half their files. By then, nobody could remember who was supposed to have access, and a support ticket turned into a week-long scramble. Another time, a marketing team spun up dozens of private channels for agencies. Membership management turned into a nightmare when campaigns overlapped and half the invited partners changed firms after the first review cycle. Everyone swore off private channels for partner projects after that. The pattern is clear. Private channels work for focused internal scenarios, not sprawling projects or anything needing external input. Shared channels are a lifesaver for collaborating across employers, cutting down on duplicate teams, and sketchy file sharing. And when no channel model does the trick, when you see lots of churn or compliance needs are just too specific, building a whole new team is the only real answer. But the decision isn't final once you click create. No matter how carefully you plan, structures change, people leave, policies evolve, or IT drops a new ban on private channels. And that's where a whole new set of risks can ambush your team, especially if you bet everything on privacy controls that don't cover lifecycle headaches. Because what really happens when someone important walks out the door or your organization pulls the plug on private channels isn't always visible until things start breaking. Surprising risks and gotchas. What happens when people leave or policies change? If you've ever felt confident about your meticulously crafted team structure, set the permissions just so, and walked away thinking your sensitive content was bulletproof, here's where reality interrupts. The idea that everything's set in stone in Microsoft Teams, files, chats, permissions lasts until someone leaves the company or IT decides to update a security policy overnight. That's when weird things start happening, especially if you rely on private channels to contain your sensitive work. Let's say your private channel has become HQ for an important project. Files are uploaded, chats happen daily, and everyone assumes the setup will last as long as the team does. The catch nobody tells you about. Private channels store their files in an entirely separate SharePoint site, not the team's main drive. It seems tidy at first, but this separate storage introduces hidden dependencies. For starters, every private channel must have at least one owner who can manage membership and channel settings. If that person leaves, whether it's a planned exit or a sudden layoff, you risk a true orphaned site. Suddenly, nobody left in the organization has the full set of rights to unlock files or adjust access. Even global admins have a mess to clean up, usually needing to jump into SharePoint directly just to recover documents or reassign permissions. One finance team I talked to hit this exact wall. Their private channel owner was responsible for quarterly reports, sensitive forecasts, and audit materials, all kept separate for good reason. The day the owner left for another company, the remaining team members realized they were locked out of the document library. Not just read-only, completely blocked from even seeing their files. Recovery meant looping in IT, requesting SharePoint admin intervention, and hoping they acted fast enough that work didn't stall for days. Sharing structures that seemed logical turned into a scramble with urgent files tied up in permissions drama. Guest access doesn't get any less confusing. In private channels, guests must be manually added and are essentially re-invited from scratch. Unlike shared channels, guests in private channels don't automatically carry over the same rights or seamless access. And if the private channel is ever deleted, intentionally or by accident, all those guest permissions vanish, sometimes with no notice. Shared channels are slightly kinder, preserving access for guests who are set up properly in both organizations, but you still run into moments where a single directory sync issue can yank files away from people overnight. It's not exactly the kind of surprise you want when a deadline is involved. The really tricky part comes when an administrator or a compliance manager decides it's time to clamp down. Maybe your organization decides to disable private channels after realizing the risk of shadow SharePoint sites and out-of-site content. What happens next isn't pretty. Users can lose access to live projects, ongoing chats are locked, and files can become inaccessible until someone with the right level of admin access steps in to remediate. Teams rarely gives users a heads up or a graceful handover. One day everything works, the next day you're greeted with errors or missing tabs. For teams that ran entire business processes in private channels, this disruption hits productivity hard. Data retention is its own thicket. In regular teams and shared channels, retention and eDiscovery tools tend to capture activities and files under one roof. With private channels, retention policies have to be set up separately on the shadow SharePoint site. If you forget or nobody mentions it, those files can quietly slip through the cracks of your compliance footprint. Searching across teams might not show results from private channels, So audits and investigations end up incomplete unless you remember those hidden sites every time. It's an easy oversight when you're handling dozens or hundreds of teams and channels. It's no wonder some organizations put a hard ban on private channels altogether. The risk equation just doesn't add up. They'd rather keep everything above the waterline, visible and manageable, even if it means more teams or more careful guest management. Admins often end up with workarounds like spinning up extra teams for sensitive subgroups or using shared channels with carefully controlled membership. This way, when staff churn hits or policy changes roll out, the risk of orphaned content or mysteriously vanished files is much lower. What all these scenarios have in common is that private channels bring a layer of risk most users don't see until something breaks. If you don't plan for owner turnover, sudden permission changes, or organizational policy shifts, things unravel fast. Thinking a private channel is set it and forget it sets you up for surprise outages, lost files, and a stack of IT tickets from frustrated end users. Next time you're choosing between channel types, it pays to look a year ahead, not just at the access list in front of you. And with some organizations pushing team structures to their limits, avoiding these common pitfalls turns into real job security for anyone responsible for keeping business moving. As admins have learned the hard way, planning for change is the only plan that really lasts. Now, with the risks laid out, it comes down to making the next choice with your eyes open. The sharpest teams admins don't rely on gut instinct or follow whatever policy happens to be trending. They start with the scenario: who actually needs to see or do what apps need to work, and how changes down the line might shake things up. It always pays off to pause and ask, will this setup hold together after a few turnovers, or when IT tweaks the rules? Making the right call isn't just about technical know-how, it's about keeping end users out of permission snares and giving yourself fewer headaches later. For more practical tips like these, hit subscribe and stay ahead.